Hello and welcome to the latest Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool ECHO. I'm Matt Addison and ahead of Liverpool's Champions League last 16 first leg clash with RB Leipzig on Tuesday, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the RedBall Group once again. Last year we spoke with Red Bull Salzburg boss Jesse Marsch. Well, there's plenty of links to Liverpool, not least Sadio Mane, Naby Keita and Takumi Minamino. Ralf Rangnick might no longer be a part of the Red Bull project, but he's been instrumental for them over the last few years, and much of Jurgen Klopp's philosophy was based on his. There's also an even more contemporary link, which I'll be discussing in a short while with the Echo's business of football writer Dave Powell, as Reds owners Fenway Sports Group look to the next stage of their project within football. But first, here's a conversation with Karan Tejwani, the author of the brilliant book Wings of Change, which looks into how the Red Bull Group work, how they made their mark in football, and with RB Leipzig now the pinnacle of the sporting conglomerate, it's the perfect time to take another in-depth look. Karan, I'd like to start with a look really at the Red Bull Group and sort of how that came about really. Take us back to the start first of all. That was, in your book, one of the most interesting parts for me. It was sort of where they came from and sort of the mission of them when they first started up really.
Yeah, they started off in 2005 with the takeover of Red Bull Salzburg, or Austria Salzburg as they were known before Red Bull took over. Obviously, Austria Salzburg were a relatively struggling club in Austria. They had a bit of trouble with in terms of money, and they weren't able to take themselves to the next level. And they were almost going bankrupt in a way. But they had a bit of history before that. They played in the UEFA Cup final in the previous decade in 1994 against Inter, which they lost, and they had a bit of domestic history when they won a few league titles here and there. But at the turn of the millennium, they were struggling and they didn't really have the means to get to the next level. So it seemed natural that Red Bull would invest in them. Red Bull obviously had a bit of interest in sport previously. They mainly worked in motorsport and winter sports, extreme sports. But football was seen as, the natural avenue for them to go to because of the natural reach of football itself. It's the most popular sport in the world, and that is what Red Bull thrive on. Getting that sort of attention and creating a brand for themselves. And so Austria Salzburg seemed like the natural choice because Red Bull were a Salzburg company. Dietrich Mateschitz, the founder of Red Bull, the co-founder of Red Bull, was a Salzburg man. He was Salzburg born and bred. He paid his taxes in Salzburg. He lived in Salzburg, so it seemed right for him to go for the local club. Now, when Austria Salzburg were taken over by Red Bull, they changed their name, their colors, their history, their stadium name. So we all know how it was, and it was very controversial because people don't like being stripped of their identity, or their football clubs being stripped of their identity. So it wasn't a very popular move, even though Red Bull were a local company. So they faced a bit of backlash there, but eventually it grew on them because of most of them because of how Red Bull appeased to the local community. They played the local songs, the local anthems before matches, and they tried to communicate with the fans more. And they were winning trophies. That was the main part. They were winning trophies. They won the league title a couple of times between 2005 and 2010 or 11 when the structure changed. But initially it was a tough start for them, and after Salzburg, they moved over to the US with the New York Red Bulls in 2006. That was seen as a combination. That was done due to a combination of factors, where Red Bull identified the USA as a strong football market, and they also identified it as a strong energy drink market. So it was a combination of those two coming together. And then in 2007, they moved to Brazil. In 2009, they moved to Germany in controversial fashion.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of sort of links with Liverpool, with all of those teams, of course. And I suppose it sort of ties in with how it works as well. How do those sorts of teams work together as one big Red Bull group? Because even though they're individual clubs, there is sort of links between them as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. There's always been a link between all of them. And the biggest link has come between Salzburg and Leipzig, wherein they trade ideas, they trade players, coaches, and try to help each other out, even though they're in different divisions and different structures. But that has been a topic of controversy for them, where people feel it's unethical to do so because it gives these two teams an advantage, and that is true. But the main part where it changed for them, where this trading of players and ideas became a big thing was in 2012 when Ralf Rangnick joined and changed the whole structure of these clubs, of the Red Bull clubs, of all of them, not just the ones in Europe. So that was a turning point for the group. Before 2012, they were winning trophies, Red Bull Salzburg, but there was no clear long-term vision for them. It wasn't a sustainable vision, and they were paying a lot of money to overage players. So people couldn't see a long-term future. And the same for Leipzig, where they were struggling in the third and fourth division of German football. So they weren't able to progress up the divisions. The common misconception is that they had an easy rise because they had a lot of money, but they had a bit of struggle because they didn't have the right people in charge. Obviously, they had a lot of money and a lot of resources, but they weren't able to put that into practice until Ralf Rangnick came in and changed the whole structure.
Yeah, Rangnick of particular interest, of course, because of his influence on Jurgen Klopp and Liverpool. And I suppose without Ralf Rangnick, we probably don't see Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool, or certainly not the same Jurgen Klopp that Liverpool fans have come to know and love.
Yeah, possibly. Klopp obviously had a different education to Rangnick. He grew up in the Mainz system under Wolfgang Frank, who is a similar manager to Ralf Rangnick. They all grew up with the same footballing identity of going away from the traditional German sweeper system of the 90s. They won the World Cup in 1990, and Germany felt that the sweeper system could last them forever. But that wasn't true because at the time, tactics were changing. And from the end of the 1990s until the start of 2000s, German football really struggled, despite reaching a World Cup final in that period. They didn't really have a long-term future playing the sweeper system. So it wasn't until Rangnick and a few of these other people came around and implemented a new philosophy that German football started to excel once again. At the Euros in 2004, they finished bottom of their group. And 10 years later, they won the World Cup. Now, that could largely be attributed to the work of Ralf Rangnick and Jurgen Klopp and Wolfgang Frank and several of these people who changed the German footballing idea. And, you can see this trend with this modern Liverpool team where Jurgen Klopp and Liverpool are fans of these Red Bull players. Joel Matip didn't play for Red Bull, but he played for Schalke under Ralf Rangnick. Keita was signed from Leipzig. Mane was signed from Southampton, who previously played for Salzburg. And Minamino was signed last year from Salzburg, and he moved to Southampton now. So you can see why Klopp likes these players. It's because they play in a similar way, and there's a similar footballing idea ingrained in these players.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about Upamecano and Ibrahima Konate shortly, but are there sort of any other players that stand out, probably more at Salzburg and Leipzig, that potentially will move on to a bigger club soon, do you think? Possibly even Liverpool?
You could say the whole team, actually, or both starting 11s are doing incredibly well. Obviously, we saw Szoboszlai move from Salzburg to Leipzig this winter. That, I feel, is just a start. Hwang also moved last summer. But at Leipzig, you could see players like Sabitzer, Tyler Adams, Upamecano, obviously, Peter Gulaschi. They all have the quality to play at this level because they have this idea of playing a modern attacking vertical way. So there's a lot of talent across both teams, and you could easily say that a large majority of the players who consistently start for these two clubs could easily make the jump anywhere in Europe. Patson Daca has been mentioned a lot. So too Seko Keita this season, who's been exceptional with his goal scoring. He's scored about 22 odd goals, I think. So there's a lot of players on both teams who could easily make the jump to anywhere in Europe.
I think probably Upamecano and Konate are the ones that sort of stand out in terms of Liverpool, not least because they probably need to sign a centre-back when it comes to the summer. I mean, those are two big names, but they have relatively modest release clauses heading into the summer. How sort of highly rated are they? And do you think they would be both tailor-made for a Premier League club?
Yeah, both of them for sure. Upamecano naturally gets more of the attention because he was great last season and he's done similarly well this season. But at the time when Konate was consistently fit, and Konate's missed the last season and a half due to injury. He's missed most of the last season and a half due to injury. But I always felt that Konate is the more capable one out of him and Upamecano. But due to injury, he's not been able to show that. But there's no denying that both of them are great players and they will have good futures in the game. Upamecano has been linked to almost every top Premier League club. But I do think he'll move to Bayern Munich in the end. That seems like the natural move for him. And it seems like the right move, staying in the same environment. I still do feel that he has some, don't want to say deficiencies in his game, but he is lacking in some areas. And that was exposed in the Champions League, especially against Manchester United when they lost 5-0 and he was all over the place. But they're definitely two good players, and they have good futures in the game for sure. Konate, I think, still needs a little more time, to get back into full fitness and maintaining that level of fitness. He's obviously a very talented footballer, and I hope it works out for him, but he needs a bit of time, I suppose.
Yeah, still a long way to go in both of their careers. And it's interesting you mentioned sort of Patson Daca as well, another one who is very young and very talented. He was part of the Red Bull Salzburg team, I think, who won the UEFA Youth League. I wanted to sort of touch upon that. They won that in 2017 at a competition that I sort of keep my eye on with regards to Liverpool's youth teams. You sort of think of bigger name clubs in that competition. You think of Chelsea are recent winners, or the Spanish giants, Bayern Munich. But for a team such as Salzburg to go all the way in that competition, I think they knocked out Paris Saint-Germain, Manchester City, Atletico Madrid possibly as well in that little run that they had. I mean, that's a big achievement for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it is for sure. I think I always say that's the biggest achievement in Red Bull's footballing era since 2005. They've won league titles, and the Leipzig have gone to the Champions League semi-final, but I always feel that winning the youth league was the biggest achievement of their Red Bull of the footballing era they've had, because it solidified and sort of legitimized their youth philosophy. Rangnick came in 2012 and he revolutionized the whole youth system. And 5 years later, which is a relatively short time, in 5 years they won the biggest youth competition in football, or in European football. But it is a big deal for them. And Patson Daca was, at the time, he wasn't seen as a pretty big deal because he joined in the winter of 2017 and he didn't really have much time to spend with them. But he scored a few crucial goals. He scored in the semi-final. He scored the winner, I think, against Barcelona. And as you said, they beat some pretty big clubs. When you think of Benfica, Barcelona, Chelsea, City, PSG, Atletico Madrid, they beat them all consecutively. And those are some of the biggest clubs and the most potent clubs in Europe when it comes to developing young players. There's a fun snippet in 2017 when they beat Atletico Madrid at their home stadium. That youth game, more people attended that youth game than the senior team's next home game in the league. So that just about shows how interested people were in youth football. And when this whole new youth-centered approach came in 2012 with Ralf Rangnick, people felt they weren't being serious about it. But it's probably the thing that the fans, they take the most pride in their youth than anything else in Salzburg. So it's a pretty big deal for them, and they take pride in their players going far in their careers.
Yeah, especially when they're known as a sort of selling club, for want of a better term. It's really, really crucial that they do that. And it's interesting as well for me that Marco Rose, the Borussia Monchengladbach manager at the moment, being linked with Borussia Dortmund, I believe, over in Germany. He was the manager at that time, so it's sort of been a big rise for him as well. That was a sort of marker, I suppose, something that he would look back and think that was possibly a big moment in his career as well.
Yeah, it was for sure. And that was like the start of his very good record in European football. He won the Youth League in 2017. The next year, he was a Europa League semi-finalist with Salzburg, it's not a normal achievement for an Austrian club to go that far. And he's carried on in the Champions League with Gladbach now. But yeah, it was a start of a very good career for him, and he worked alongside some very good assistant coaches. René Maric, who's popular for running his blog Spiel Belagerung. He got him from that blog, and they decided to work together. And obviously, René Maric has gone from being a blogger online to now being a Champions League round of 16 member with Gladbach, and they're going to play against it's Manchester City, yeah. But yeah, they've been doing quite well, and it was a good start in Marco Rose's career. He's still very young, and I wouldn't be surprised in the future if he goes to Liverpool because of that similar line of thought. Maybe after Klopp leaves, he definitely should be the top target, provided he does well at Dortmund.
Yeah, that's something I was going to ask you about as well. I mean, we talk about Julian Nagelsmann. Obviously, Steven Gerrard is going to be in the mix because he's Steven Gerrard and because he's doing a fantastic job at Rangers. But Marco Rose is sort of one of those names that is a little bit under the radar. I mean, you'll know probably more than me. Is it inevitable that he goes to Borussia Dortmund next? And if 2 or 3 seasons down the line, could he potentially be a real contender, you think, for Jurgen Klopp's successor?
Yeah, Dortmund seems likely for him this season. I'll be very surprised if he does make the move. If Gladbach qualify for the Champions League and Dortmund don't, and he still makes the move, I'll be very surprised by that. But it seems tailor-made for him, the job. But on the topic of Liverpool, for sure, yeah. I think that if Klopp was to leave next year, which he won't, or if Klopp was to leave this summer, Rose or Nagelsmann would be the natural successor because of that line of thought they have with playing the game. But if it's 2024, which is when Klopp's contract expires, Gerrard has a bigger case. Hopefully by then he has a bigger career with Rangers or wherever he goes. But I think those three would be the top targets: Rose, Nagelsmann, and Gerrard, if they carry on the same way they started in. All three of them still very young, and Liverpool could probably see them as being their long-term managers, for the next maybe 7-8 years, like Klopp has been. But yeah, it seems like the smarter thing to do, targeting people like Rose or Nagelsmann. And Gerrard, the job is for him eventually. It's like maybe Klopp's keeping the seat warm for him. But if Klopp was to leave anytime soon before 2024, I think Rose or Nagelsmann would be the more logical option.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to sort of see how they get on. As you're saying, that the Champions League last 16, Borussia Monchengladbach coming up against Manchester City. So I think his name certainly would be on the map if they could knock out Pep Guardiola's men. But just before we finish, I'm aware we've done a fair bit of sort of praising the Red Bull Group, and maybe they're not particularly popular in certain segments, particularly over in Germany. There's been lots of protests against them at times in Austria as well. And I think it would be only fair really to sort of touch on that just before we finish. I mean, how do you think they should be viewed for what they're doing, Red Bull? Do you see it as a positive thing? They're putting investment in, they're making this sport better, and is that not necessarily the case from everybody? As I say, over in the Bundesliga in particular, there's been some pretty vocal speakers against what Red Bull are doing.
I can see why people dislike them, and to be quite honest, I'm personally on their side. There's often the confusion that I support what Red Bull do because I sort of wrote the book, but I don't personally endorse what Red Bull do because of, in a way, it's kind of impure. You don't get joy in seeing clubs like RB Leipzig or Red Bull Salzburg succeeding, whereas you get great joy in seeing clubs like Atalanta or Ajax because they've sort of made it right from scratch. With RB Leipzig, they're the most notorious club in Germany right now, probably. And from their start, or when they reached the Bundesliga, them breaking or circumventing the 50+1 rule was probably the biggest sin in German football. You don't get past those low rules and have an easy ride. So I can see why fans dislike them, and their actions after that, where they sort of, in a way, silence fans at certain points. German football is very vocal, very political, and they care a lot about societal issues. And at times, there's been cases where RB Leipzig, the club, have wanted to silence their fans on talking about such issues. So silencing that fan voice it's not a very popular move to make, and you can see why they're so disliked. It's the same with, you could say, with City and PSG, where they've been taken over by a state and changed the way the game is seen and the way they spend and all that. It's an unfair advantage they have just because they have such rich owners, and it's the same for Red Bull as well and RB Leipzig. So while you can celebrate their football achievements, you can say that they're probably one of the best run clubs in Europe from top to bottom. It's also worth mentioning that they have an advantage that not many other clubs have. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I can see why. I'm more on the side of why fans dislike them.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Thank you very much for joining me, Karan Tejwani, I should say, author of the brilliant book Wings of Change. Do check that out if you are interested in reading a little bit more about the Red Bull Group. I'm certainly fascinated by it, and I am being absolutely genuine when I say that. It was a fantastic book, really, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm joined now for the second part of the show by the Echo's business of football writer, Dave Powell. Dave, I don't know about you, but the Red Bull Group absolutely fascinates me. There's sort of a lot of financial power behind them. They don't mess about with investment and things like that, but there's been a lot of criticism of them as well. I mean, just first and foremost, where is it that you stand on what they're doing? Are you sort of broadly in favour of them, or do you maybe look at them with a little bit more scepticism?
I know they're deeply unpopular in Germany, purely for the fact that the German model is kind of 51-49, at least in terms of kind of fan ownership or representation. But while RB Leipzig conform to that, there's a whole different matter about the amount of members who vote towards those things. Some of them being Red Bull employees, etc. So they're deeply unpopular in Germany. But as a model, you can see why other clubs want to replicate it. I think it's something which drives huge value. I mean, you only have to look at some of the conveyor belt of talent which they've managed to produce through the likes of FC Liefering and to Red Bull Salzburg, which kind of knocks onto RB Leipzig, sits at the very summit. But I think it's a model which will ultimately, I think, be the one which follows, which other clubs follow moving forward, because it, in terms of market value, it's phenomenal the amount of increase they get to see on players. They get first dibs on some of Europe's brightest and best. I mean, Dominik Szoboszlai is a kind of most recent example of that, I suppose. There's things in place there to make sure that both they and Salzburg can compete in the same competitions now. But ultimately, I mean, they are all under the same umbrella, so there's a mutual interest along it. But no, I mean, I suppose from a fan perspective, I don't particularly like multi-club platforms. It doesn't really chime with kind of the ethics and kind of the moral duty of the game, I suppose. However, from a business point of view, it makes perfect sense, and you can see why so many clubs want to follow something similar.
I know there's been, obviously, as you say, a lot of sort of distrust almost of the group over in Germany in particular, where we know that fans have a great deal of power. But I mean, it's almost one of those things, isn't it, where I suppose you might look at it and think, well, if it happened to your football club and you were an RB Leipzig fan today, you've probably seen a huge benefit from it. I suppose they even might have been sceptical at the beginning. But is it almost a sort of tribal thing, do you think, where if you benefit from it, then you're probably okay with it? But if you're, say, Hoffenheim, who maybe were slightly higher up the table before RB Leipzig came in, maybe you might look at it in a different way.
I mean, the reason they chose Leipzig in the first place was because it was a very small kind of provincial football club with limited pushback in terms of fans. It's a tiny football club, tiny region, and they've been able to build that up. If they would have come in somewhere and tried to maybe say one of the kind of the lesser Berlin clubs, someone like Union Berlin or something, they would have never been able to push through what they wanted to. So that's the reason why they kind of started off at the entry level, really. You see it in this country, I mean, in terms of when people want to build something up, and you look at Salford, you look at Fleetwood Town, teams like that. I mean, people tend to start where there is more limited resistance to affecting change. It's very, very difficult to do that at the top end of football. I mean, you wouldn't see business coming in and changing the name of a football club from League One upwards, I don't think, given the amount of pushback. Certainly not in the Premier League. But yeah, I mean, it is a tribal thing, but it depends how well you can separate the two things. I mean, for Red Bull Salzburg and RB Leipzig, they did have a conundrum in terms of they both were playing the same competition, the Champions League last season. So before that, they've had to kind of realign their relationship with each other, whereby before it used to be they were more closely aligned because there was no crossover. So you're allowed to own, parts of two different clubs, provided there's no conflict of interest. But once there becomes a conflict of interest, then you have to. I mean, that relationship is redefined. So now it's purely in terms of the paperwork side of it, sponsorship only, I suppose, and they have the same owner. But that's the only things where there is crossover. That's the reason why that Szoboszlai was never a shoo-in to go to Leipzig. I mean, there was always going to be a preference because of the business model, but they couldn't force that move to happen because that would be affecting influence beyond what they should be. So, but yeah, in terms of a tribal thing, I think it'd be a different, if Liverpool went down that particular route, it'd be a very different approach that FSG would have to take, because there would have to be clear separation between, the kind of clubs they're doing. That's why a lot of the clubs, I mean, you look at City Football Group, the teams which there's no real desire for City Football Group to see Girona succeed in La Liga or that type of thing, because Manchester City is who sits at the pinnacle of that. Girona and all the other clubs are, and Troyes with Chelsea, they're all clubs which just sit around the edges and are there to basically kind of foist your top talent on, or the talent that you can't get work permits for, etc., or need to play X amount of games to obtain their work permit, or things like that. So there is huge benefits to these relationships, but I don't think from Liverpool fans would have too much to worry about in terms of having kind of another club which is a direct competitor. I think Salzburg's success has probably made things a bit more difficult for Red Bull, if anything, because they've had to kind of redefine that relationship from the very start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Szoboszlai there. Of course, Erling Haaland is a prime example of that as well. Obviously went to Dortmund rather than Leipzig, and I suppose that is the case in point, isn't it? I mean, as you say, one of the reasons we're looking at the Red Bull Group is sort of to tie in with potentially what could happen with Liverpool, with FSG in the future. I mean, you sort of touched upon it there, but what do you think Liverpool could potentially learn from the Red Bull Group if they were to go down this route? There are obvious benefits to this, aren't there?
Yeah, the benefits are kind of being able to develop talent, be able to. There's a better talent pathway. I mean, for clubs, they'd rather see their players playing in European leagues, such as whether it's Segunda B or things like that, because it's more competitive than playing under 23 football, and it gives them a better grounding. There's also the benefits of sharing data analytics, medical things like that. The whole operation can be spread, and you can kind of share best practice. But if you look at the record that Red Bull have had with Salzburg and RB Leipzig, I mean, there's a club which sits at the bottom of that kind of chain, which is FC Liefering, and if you look at the likes of Hadara, I think Minamino was also something similar. But I mean, Naby Keita's been on that Salzburg route as well. So Upamecano was Liefering, then Salzburg, and then RB Leipzig. So there is a clear kind of development plan there where these guys are getting the grounding and then being able to be shifted up to the next level. And Red Bull, when they move these players on, see a huge benefit. Or they keep the cream of the crop for themselves, and that's allowed them to spoil the party at the top of European football, without having to outlay too much, because they've invested their money elsewhere in terms of being able to have their own conveyor belt of talent, which is unlike any other.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that Red Bull have come into football is effectively to promote their product, isn't it? It's sort of a marketing campaign. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case with FSG and with Liverpool. It's a very different situation. But do you think, you mentioned Manchester City before, the City Football Group, and how Etihad have sort of gone down that route with them. Do you think this would ever be appealing to FSG? Is this something that in, say, the next 5 or 10 years or whatever, they might look at doing something like this? Because there are obvious benefits, even if it wouldn't necessarily be in the same way as the Red Bull Group.
I don't think it was, but I think it is now. I don't think they had a real interest in it in seasons past, but I think now they probably see being the find a way of putting it. They count the pennies more closely than many other Premier League owners. Which is good in one sense, because it allows them to ride out the implications of a global pandemic much better. They are in rude health financially, but also, and the flip side of that is, when you compare them to the rest of the teams chasing for honours, they don't invest anywhere near those amounts, which is going to become a point soon where they're going to have to. And they probably see this as being a way to maybe get the best of both worlds, because if you look at RB Leipzig, they're able to remain competitive without throwing exorbitant amounts of money each summer at players. Ultimately, they end up getting their best players picked off them, but that's because they still remain RB Leipzig, and it's for any play, for the pinnacle of a player's career still now isn't playing for RB Leipzig. It's either to join one of Europe's elite clubs, So. I think the whole the FSG interest in the Red Bull deal was very much centred around the possibility of multi-club ownership and having someone lead that as opposed to them really leading it. So Billy Beane was going to, the idea was Billy Beane was going to lead this kind of expansion of a portfolio within Red Bull and FSG. But I mean, that's still the plan for wherever they go next. I wouldn't rule out the Premier League, if I'm honest, but. it's something which is of interest to them now, because I think they see the value in it, and it's, you can, and where there is value for an investment and a return on investment, that's where FSG come into play. And I think that's why I think in the next 5 years you'll probably see the first few shoots of this happen. I mean, Gerry Cardinale is still interested in investing in Liverpool, and to me that kind of suggests the possibility. He already owns, through his Redbird Capital Partners private equity firm, Toulouse, so French second division. There's obvious, if Cardinale invests in Liverpool, there's an obvious potential tie in there. Whether Redbird decide to come in and partner in that respect. So I think it is something which Liverpool will ultimately explore, and I think eventually it will be something which a lot of the big clubs are doing, just by I mean, the idea of feeder clubs has been knocking around since the early 90s, really. I mean, I'm from my club, I'm a boy, kind of Chester FC fan, and they were mooted as being Manchester City's feeder club for a number of years. That was always a tie-in they were seeking to find. So these things aren't new. These are relationships but now the relationships change because there's so much money involved, and getting around kind of Brexit rules and European rules. I think it's going to come even more important. So I think that Brexit may even accelerate Liverpool's interest in this, in order to kind of get their hands on the best European players.
Yeah, I was going to mention Brexit as well. I mean, Liverpool have targeted younger players. You think of Sepp van den Berg, Matis Musialowski was last summer. I mean, these sorts of players, I don't think Liverpool would have been able to sign them, because now the Brexit rules that have come into play at the start of this calendar year. I mean, is this a way around that? If Liverpool, say, were to have a feeder club elsewhere, is that a way of almost circumnavigating the rules and regulations, really?
Yes, I think it is, because signing players now is going to require. I mean, for the most part, if you're signing big players and you're Liverpool and you're paying money, Brexit's not going to make much of a difference, because all the players are going to meet the criteria. And I think it's 15 points they have to reach in order to qualify. And point scoring is based on things like international cap, status of the club you're signing from, their league, where the club were last season, that your status of your own club. So all these things, it's very easy for Liverpool to sign players and get to 15 points. But the issue comes in when players are younger. So the criteria is far more strict. So I think that this may be a way to, certainly if you're looking at 17, 18-year-olds, I mean, and these are hot property across Europe now. So you look at Jude Bellingham, Jadon Sancho, Midweeky at PSV, players like that. They are, although I've given you 3 English examples there, so it wouldn't particularly matter, but they're just 3 examples off the top of my head. But there is huge value in young talent across Europe. So in order to keep them in your farm system, to use an American parlance, I suppose, it's certainly beneficial to be able to kind of foist those players on to your feeder clubs or your partner clubs, and they can build up their own, their point system there to the point when they're able to be transferred over and be kind of welcomed into the Liverpool setup. So I think that's something which a lot of clubs are going to try and use now to get around that in order to secure the best players. I mean, you look at the likes of Szoboszlai and Upamecano, and these are something like Europe's top talent now in terms of the players who commanded there's big fees around them. There's huge potential there, but they're players who've come through kind of very low levels of European football and been built up, so that the pathway is obviously there. And I think that Michael Edwards he's always one to kind of see the value where others don't. I think if Liverpool went down this route, I think it could be really, really interesting in terms of how they develop young players, but also then it raises the question of what happens to your own youth academy. That's the thing. I mean, because they've invested so much money in this new complex at Kirkby. I mean, the idea is, I mean, you've got the 3rd most valuable Liverpool player in terms of squad value at the moment is Trent Alexander-Arnold, a product of their system. Look at some of the greatest players to have pulled on Liverpool shirts in the past 20 years. Steven Gerrard, product Liverpool's system. So there's the obligation there still to make sure that you are producing players in your locality, because that ultimately, especially at Liverpool, that's what, it's what people want. There is an expectancy to see there is a Scouser or homegrown talent representing the club in some respect. And while success is great, I think that if they lost sight of that, I think that the club would lose a little bit of its soul, I suppose. So there's a very kind of fine line, especially at Liverpool more than anywhere else. I mean, Leipzig, there's no history there in terms of producing players from kind of that region or anything like that. So Red Bull were able to do whatever they wanted. It's it's a blank canvas. There's no pushback. We're delivering success here on our terms. At Liverpool, FSG aren't delivering success on their terms. If they deliver success for the long term, it's going to have to be mindful. It's going to have to be an element of being on the terms of the fans as well. So yeah, there's pros and cons, but ultimately, I do think that this will be something that FSG pursue in the next 5 years.
Yeah, certainly something to keep an eye on. Really interesting stuff as ever. Dave Powell, thank you very much for joining me. And I suppose all eyes now are on RB Leipzig, aren't they, for the time being? But FSG, I'm sure, will be keeping an eye on the Red Bull Group more widely, well beyond Tuesday night. But yeah, Dave, thank you very much for joining me. Absolutely fantastic.